The day was warm, the kind that made the air feel thick and slow, the perfect excuse to wear something light, something that clung in all the right places. It was my stepson's birthday, a small gathering at our house with family and a few of his friends. I had spent the morning decorating, setting up food, making sure everything was perfect. But as the afternoon sun dipped lower, I found myself standing in front of my closet, debating. I wanted to look good, no, I wanted to be noticed. The dress I chose was tiny, deliberately so, soft fabric that hugged my hips, delicate straps that barely clung to my shoulders, and a hem that skimmed the tops of my thighs. When I moved just right, it was playful, teasing, just enough to turn heads without outright demanding attention. By the time the guests arrived, the backyard was alive with laughter and music. My husband was caught up in conversation, entertaining guests, while my stepson, freshly 21, was surrounded by his friends, enjoying the celebration. I moved through the crowd, the feeling of the dress brushing against my skin, making every step deliberate. It didn't take long to notice the shift, the subtle change in glances. A lingering look here, a quick flicker of eyes there, a whispered comment between two of my stepson's friends, quickly hushed when they realized I had caught them. And then his gaze. My stepson had always been respectful, polite, but tonight there was something different in his eyes, a tension that hadn't been there before. I pretended not to notice, played it off with effortless smiles, small laughs, the casual tilt of my head, but inside, my pulse quickened, my skin tingling with the awareness of being watched. I moved toward the kitchen, pretending to check on something, needing a moment to breathe. But just as I reached for a glass, I heard footsteps behind me, the soft creak of the floorboard, a presence that sent a warm shiver down my spine. "You wore that on purpose, didn't you?" The voice was quiet, just behind me, barely above a whisper, a statement, not a question. I turned my head slightly, glancing over my shoulder, finding him standing closer than I expected, closer than he should have been. His eyes held something unreadable, something I shouldn't entertain, but couldn't ignore. I smirked, gripping the edge of the counter lightly. And if I did? His breath hitched just enough for me to notice, his jaw tightening, his fingers flexing at his sides. The air between us grew thick, heavy with something unspoken. The sounds of laughter and music faded into the background, and my heartbeat filled my ears. His gaze traveled lower, lingering before he quickly looked away, exhaling through his nose. "You like being looked at, don't you?" His voice was low, careful, testing the waters. I tilted my head, my fingers grazing the countertop, my body still turned slightly away. "Maybe. Depends on who's looking." His lips parted slightly, as if forming a response, but he hesitated. I could see it the way he was weighing his next words, fighting something inside him. "This is wrong," he murmured, but he still didn't move away. "Then leave." I felt his sharp inhale. A moment passed, a long, heated, dangerous moment. He didn't leave. Instead, his fingers brushed against my arm, a fleeting touch, barely there, but enough to send a jolt down my spine. My breath hitched, my grip on the counter tightening. The space between us shrank, charged, unrelenting. A voice called out from the backyard, my husband's voice, a reminder, a warning. He pulled away abruptly, jaw tight, hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I should go." Probably, my voice was softer now, laced with something I couldn't quite name. He hesitated for a second longer before turning, disappearing down the hall. I stood there for a long time, the heat from his presence still clinging to my skin, the dress feeling even tighter than before. I poured myself a drink, trying to steady my hands, but the tension in my body refused to settle. I stepped back out onto the patio, my expression controlled, my movements easy, as if nothing had happened. But my mind was still replaying every second of that moment, the heat in his gaze, the restraint in his posture, the quiet desperation of it all. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, I felt him again, his presence lingering near the doorway, watching. I didn't look, I didn't need to, because I already knew this wasn't over. Not even close. The night carried on, but something had shifted. The air was heavier now, thick with the kind of tension that clings to the skin, refuses to be ignored. I moved through the crowd, keeping up appearances, smiling, laughing at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere, my body still humming from that moment in the kitchen. The heat of his gaze still clinging to me like a touch that never quite left. I caught glimpses of him throughout the evening, a flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision, a glance that lingered too long before looking away. Each time our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us, something neither of us had the courage to name. It was almost midnight when the party finally wound down, guests saying their goodbyes, laughter and voices fading into the warm night air. My husband was outside, walking his last few friends to their cars, leaving the house momentarily quiet. I stepped back into the kitchen, reaching for a glass of water, trying to steady the slow, insistent pulse that had settled low in my stomach. I barely had time to register the sound of footsteps before I felt him behind me, close, too close. His presence sent a wave of heat up my spine, the same way it had earlier. Only now, there was nothing between us, no guests, no noise, no distractions, just him and me, the silence pressing in around us. "You really like teasing, don't you?" His voice was lower now, rougher. I set the glass down slowly, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about." He let out a quiet laugh, but there was no amusement in it. "You do. You knew exactly what you were doing." I swallowed hard, my body tensing as I felt the heat of him behind me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my shoulder. He didn't touch me, not yet, but the space between us was non-existent, charged with something undeniable. I turned slightly, just enough to glance up at him, my breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "And if I did?" His jaw tightened. "Then that makes two of us." The word sent a thrill through me, my pulse hammering in response. I knew I should step away. I knew I should stop this before it started. But I didn't. Instead, I tilted my chin up just slightly, a silent challenge, an invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to give. His hand brushed against my hip, the lightest touch, but it sent a shockwave through me. "This is wrong," he murmured, but his fingers didn't move away. If anything, they gripped tighter, pressing into the soft fabric of my dress, holding me in place. "Then why are you still here?" His breath hitched, his grip tightening before he exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to convince himself of something. "You're making it impossible to leave." The air around us seemed to shrink, my skin burning beneath the weight of his gaze. My body betrayed me, leaning into the touch, craving more, even as my mind screamed at me to pull away. And then, before I could second-guess it, before I could think about the consequences, I closed the space between us. His lips crushed against mine, all hesitation gone.